The humid air of late summer still clung to the streets of Waukegan, Illinois. On the evening of September 16, 1992, in this working-class suburb north of Chicago, the rhythms of life were dictated by shift work and the quiet hum of domesticity. For 11-year-old Holly Ann Staker, the evening was supposed to be a testament to her emerging maturity. Known throughout her neighborhood as a child who possessed a sense of responsibility far beyond her years, Holly was often entrusted with the care of others. On this night, she was babysitting 2 younger children in an apartment while her mother, a hard-working woman dedicated to providing for her family, headed out for a late-night shift. To the outside observer, the building on Grand Avenue was just another brick structure in a town where people looked out for one another, yet beneath this veneer of Midwestern stability, a predator was navigating the shadows, unnoticed by a community that still believed its doors could remain unlocked. The transition from a peaceful evening to a forensic nightmare began with a silence that was fundamentally wrong. When Holly's mother returned in the early hours of September 17th, she did not find the expected scene of a sleeping household. Instead, the apartment door stood slightly ajar, a small physical detail that served as the first logical indicator of an intrusion. Inside, the 2 younger children were physically unharmed, but left in a state of eerie abandonment. The search for Holly ended in the small bathroom, a confined space that would soon become one of the most scrutinized crime scenes in Illinois history. There, the 11-year-old lay lifeless. The initial visual analysis suggested a struggle defined by overwhelming physical disparity. Holly had been stabbed multiple times and subjected to a brutal sexual assault. The sheer violence of the act pointed toward a perpetrator driven by a specific explosive combination of predatory opportunism and a deep-seated pathology of control. From a behavioral standpoint, the choice of the bathroom as the final location for the assault suggests a desire for concealment within the apartment, an attempt to muffle the sounds of a struggle that the perpetrator knew could alert neighbors through the thin walls of the complex. Investigators arriving on the scene were met with a dichotomy. The innocence of a child's world toys and school books contrasted against the visceral evidence of a high-intensity homicide. At this early stage, the logic of the investigation was dictated by the immediate. The absence of forced entry on the main door suggested 2 distinct hypotheses. Either the victim knew her attacker and allowed entry, or the perpetrator had navigated an unsecured point of access with practiced ease. As the morning sun rose over Waukegan, the town's collective sense of security evaporated, replaced by a cold, analytical realization that a calculated evil had been invited into their midst, leaving behind a puzzle that would take decades of scientific advancement to truly solve. The discovery of Holly's body acted as a catalyst for a frantic, almost desperate investigative pursuit. In the immediate aftermath, the Waukegan Police Department found themselves operating within a high-pressure vacuum. The brutal nature of the crime targeting a child so widely loved and within the perceived safety of a residential complex created a deafening public outcry for swift resolution. It is within this atmosphere of urgency that the seeds of a systemic failure are often sown, as the logical imperative to find the who frequently overrides the more tedious scientific examination of the how. Detectives began by canvassing the apartment complex, looking for anomalies in the social fabric of the neighborhood. They were searching for a specific profile, a local male, likely with a history of impulsive behavior, who would have had the proximity and opportunity to observe Holly's routine. This search inevitably led them to 19-year-old Juan Rivera. Rivera did not fit the traditional mold of a calculated predator, yet he resided on the periphery of the law, having had minor prior encounters with local authorities. To the investigators, he represented a viable lead in a case that was rapidly growing cold. However, A deeper logical analysis of the evidence available at that moment reveals a startling lack of physical connectivity. There were no fingerprints belonging to Rivera at the scene. There was no blood on his clothing, no witness who could definitively place him entering or exiting the apartment at the time of the murder. Despite this forensic void, the investigation shifted from an open-ended inquiry into a focused pursuit of Rivera. This phenomenon, known in criminal psychology as tunnel vision, occurs when investigators subconsciously filter out exculpatory evidence to protect a primary hypothesis. They didn't just want Rivera to be the killer. They needed him to be, for the sake of a community that was paralyzed by fear. The subsequent interaction between Juan Rivera and the Waukegan police would become a grim case study in the anatomy of a false confession. Taken into custody on October 26, 1992, Rivera was subjected to a psychological siege that lasted 4 days. To understand how an innocent man could eventually sign a document admitting to a heinous crime, one must analyze the interrogation environment created by the detectives. Rivera was held without access to a lawyer or his family, effectively isolating him from any external reality check. He was subjected to the Reed technique, a multi-step interrogation method designed to break down a suspect's resistance through a combination of empathy and overwhelming accusation. In this setting, the investigators used maximization tactics, exaggerating the evidence they claimed to have, such as telling Rivera his DNA was found at the scene, while simultaneously offering minimization, suggesting that the murder was an accident or a moment of temporary insanity that could be forgiven if he simply told the truth. As the hours turned into days, the logic of the interrogation shifted from a search for truth to a battle of attrition. Deprived of sleep and subjected to repetitive, leading questions, Rivera's cognitive defenses began to erode. In a state of psychological exhaustion, the human mind often seeks the path of least resistance. For Rivera, that path was the narrative being offered by his interrogators. Analysis of the interrogation transcripts shows a disturbing pattern. The police would provide specific details of the crime scene, the location of the body, the type of weapon used, the nature of the assault, and then ask Rivera to confirm them. This fed information allowed the prosecution to later claim that Rivera possessed insider knowledge that only the killer could have known. In reality, he was merely reflecting a script written by the detectives themselves. The final confession was not a spontaneous admission of guilt, but a mosaic of coerced statements, many of which were factually inconsistent with the physical reality of the crime scene. Despite these inconsistencies, the momentum of the case was now unstoppable. The logic of the prosecution relied heavily on the emotional weight of the confession, knowing that to a jury, a signed admission of guilt is often more persuasive than a mountain of forensic doubt. When Rivera's defense pointed out that his description of the crime did not match the medical examiner's findings, such as the number of stab wounds or the sequence of events, the prosecution dismissed these as the unreliable memories of a panicked killer. This circular reasoning is a hallmark of wrongful convictions. The confession proves the guilt, and any evidence to the contrary is simply a failure of the guilty man's memory. The systemic failure was not just in the interrogation room, but in the entire legal apparatus that allowed such a flawed document to serve as the cornerstone of a capital case. The human cost of this logical collapse was profound. Juan Rivera, barely an adult, was facing the machinery of the state with nothing but his retracted confession to defend him. For the Staker family, the arrest provided a temporary sense of closure, a belief that the monster had been caught. Yet, a more rigorous analysis suggests that by focusing so intensely on Rivera, the authorities had effectively granted the real perpetrator a 20-year head start. The predator who had actually entered that bathroom on Grand Avenue was still at large. His DNA left at the scene like a ticking time bomb of truth that the 1992 justice system was not yet equipped, or perhaps not yet willing to diffuse. This was a tragedy of two halves: an innocent life taken in a bathroom and another innocent life being slowly dismantled in an interrogation room, both victims of a system that valued the appearance of justice over the pursuit of actual, verifiable truth. As the trial loomed, the atmosphere in Lake County was one of righteous indignation. The narrative had been set. The troubled youth had succumbed to a dark impulse and destroyed a symbol of the town's innocence. This narrative was reinforced by a media landscape that prioritized sensationalism over investigative skepticism. The logic of guilt by association and guilt by confession had taken root so deeply that the total absence of physical evidence was treated as a mere technicality. The trial of Juan Rivera would not be a search for the killer of Holly and Staker, but a validation of an investigative process that had already decided the answer. In this court of law, the burden of proof had subtly shifted. It was no longer the state's job to prove Rivera was there beyond a reasonable doubt, but Rivera's impossible task to prove he was somewhere else when he had already confessed to being there. The stage was set for a verdict that would haunt the state of Illinois for decades, a verdict born of fear, pressure, and a catastrophic failure of investigative logic. The conviction of Juan Rivera in 1993 did not just mark the end of a trial. It marked the beginning of a profound systemic hibernation. To understand why justice remained paralyzed for 2 decades, one must analyze the logical architecture of the Lake County prosecution's case. It was a narrative built on the primacy of the confession, the psychological belief that a human being would never admit to a crime they did not commit. This belief served as a cognitive shield, protecting the state from the inconvenient biological data that was already beginning to scream for attention. During the initial trial, the forensic evidence was not merely secondary. It was treated as a distraction. The DNA found on Holly Staker's body was presented to the jury as an unexplained anomaly rather than a definitive exclusion. In the pre-CSI era of 1993, the logic of the courtroom was still dominated by the weight of the spoken word over the precision of the genetic code. Analyzing the prosecution's tactical maneuvering reveals a calculated use of secondary source theories. When the defense pointed out that the DNA profile from the crime scene did not match Rivera, the state countered with a hypothesis that was as speculative as it was damaging. They suggested that the DNA could have been deposited at an earlier time, or that Rivera was simply an accomplice to an unidentified primary offender. This logic was circular and self-sustaining. By refusing to allow the DNA to speak for itself, the legal system created a closed loop where Rivera's guilt was the only permissible conclusion. This was not just a failure of individual judgment, but a manifestation of institutional momentum. Once a high-profile arrest is made, the machinery of the state, the police, the prosecutors, and the local media becomes heavily invested in the success of that narrative. To admit error is to admit that a predator is still roaming the streets of Waukegan, a reality that the political climate of 1992 was not prepared to handle. Inside the walls of the Joliet Correctional Center, Juan Rivera became a living relic of this failed logic. For 20 years, his life was defined by the rhythm of steel doors and the crushing weight of a crime he could not remember committing. From a psychological perspective, Rivera's survival depended on a fragile cognitive resilience. He was forced to reconcile the man he knew himself to be with the monster the state of Illinois insisted he was. Meanwhile, the Staker family was left to build their lives on a foundation of false closure. They had been told the monster was caught, a belief that allowed them to process their grief, yet it was a peace built on a lie. This is the double victimization of wrongful convictions. The family of the deceased is denied true justice, and an innocent man is systematically stripped of his humanity. The shift from stagnation to movement began not in a courtroom, but in a laboratory. As we move into the early 2000s, the logic of forensic science underwent a seismic shift. The advent of short tandem repeat (STR) testing allowed scientists to look at biological evidence with a granularity that was impossible in 1992. When the Innocence Project took interest in Rivera's case, they didn't just look for new witnesses. They looked for the microscopic truth. By 2011, the legal battle reached a tipping point. Analysis of the updated DNA testing showed that the material found on Holly was a single-source profile, meaning it belonged to only one man, and that man was definitively not Juan Rivera. This forensic reality shattered the accomplice and contamination theories that the prosecution had relied on for years. The logic was now undeniable. If the DNA belonged to the killer and the DNA wasn't Rivera's, then Rivera was not the killer. However, the state's response to this new data provides a chilling insight into the psychology of legal denial. Even when faced with 100% exclusionary DNA evidence, Lake County prosecutors fought to maintain the conviction, arguing that Rivera could have still been involved without leaving biological traces. This residual guilt hypothesis represents the final, desperate stage of tunnel vision, a refusal to accept a paradigm shift even when the old paradigm has been scientifically demolished. It took a decisive ruling from the Illinois Appellate Court in December 2011 to finally break this deadlock. The court's opinion was a scathing critique of the original investigation, highlighting the fact that the confession was riddled with inconsistencies that the police had willfully ignored. The moment Juan Rivera walked out of prison in early 2012, the logic of the Holly Staker case had to be completely reconstructed. The void left by his exoneration was filled with a terrifying question: who? For 20 years, the true predator had enjoyed the ultimate cover, the conviction of another man. If we analyze the behavioral patterns of serial offenders, this period of unearned freedom often allows a killer to refine their methods and expand their hunting grounds. The authorities were no longer dealing with a cold case. They were dealing with an active failure of public safety. The investigation was forced back to the bathroom on Grand Avenue, but this time, the eyes of the detectives were no longer clouded by the need for a quick arrest. They were looking for a ghost who had been hiding in the National DNA Database, CODIS, all along. The hit came in 2015, and the name Darren Dion Van sent a shockwave through the Midwest investigative community. Van was already in custody in Indiana for a series of murders, and the DNA link to Holly Staker provided the final missing piece of his early predatory history. From a logical standpoint, Van was the perfect suspect that the 1992 team had never considered. He was a transient predator, a man who navigated the industrial corridors between Illinois and Indiana, preying on those who would not be missed. The discovery of Van's DNA in Holly's case did more than identify a killer. It exposed the structural flaws of a system that prioritized a local scapegoat over a regional threat. The Williford connection also began to emerge during this period, a complex forensic trail suggesting that Van's DNA was present at other crime scenes, including a brutal assault in 2000. This leads to a disturbing hypothesis. Was Holly Staker's murder the starting point of a decades-long spree? The logic of Van's movement suggests a man who learned early on that the cracks in the judicial system were wide enough to hide in. While Rivera was aging in a cell, Van was potentially claiming more victims. The final analysis of this third chapter is one of bitter irony. The very system designed to protect the innocent had, through its own arrogance and logical fallacies, acted as the primary protector of a serial killer. The tragedy of Waukegan was not just the death of a girl in a bathroom, but the 20-year silence that followed, a silence maintained by a legal structure that refused to believe that its own truth could be a lie. The transition from a stagnant conviction to a forensic upheaval required more than just the passage of time. It required a fundamental shift in the logic of the American legal system. As Juan Rivera entered his second decade of incarceration, a new breed of legal thinkers began to dismantle the infallibility of the Lake County conviction. This period of scientific resurrection was spearheaded by the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern Law, where attorneys like Lawrence Marshall began to treat the Holly Staker case not as a closed file, but as a symptomatic failure of modern jurisprudence. To analyze this stage of the journey is to examine the logic of persistence. Despite the overwhelming emotional weight of the case, the legal team had to operate with a cold, surgical precision, identifying the hairline fractures in a prosecution that had relied almost exclusively on a psychologically coerced confession. At the heart of this scientific resurgence was the evolution of DNA technology. By the mid-2000s, forensic science had moved beyond the rudimentary testing of the early 90s into the era of STR, short tandem repeat analysis. This allowed for the creation of a definitive genetic barcode from even the most degraded samples. When the court finally granted the defense the right to retest the biological evidence from the Staker crime scene, the results were more than just an exclusion of Juan Rivera. They provided a logical impossibility for the state's narrative. The DNA recovered from the victim's body was identified as a single-source male profile. Logically, if Rivera were the perpetrator, this profile should have been his. When it was not, the state was forced into a defensive posture, inventing increasingly convoluted hypotheses to explain how foreign DNA could be found in such a primary, intimate context without the presence of the supposed killer's own biological material. This tension between forensic reality and prosecutorial theory reached a breaking point during Rivera's subsequent retrials. It is a startling fact of this case that the state of Illinois did not simply concede after the first signs of DNA exclusion. Instead, they prosecuted Rivera 3 separate times. Analyzing the logic of these retrials reveals a disturbing pattern of confirmatory bias within the judicial system. In each instance, the prosecution doubled down on the 1992 confession, treating it as a gold standard of evidence that superseded the laws of biology. They argued that the presence of an unknown man's DNA was merely a mystery, whereas the confession was a certainty. This period highlights a critical flaw in human logic, the tendency to prioritize a story and narrative of guilt over the silent empirical data of science. The third trial in 2009 was a masterclass in this conflict, resulting in yet another conviction, a verdict that defied the growing consensus of the international forensic community. However, a new logical disruptor emerged during this period that the prosecution could not ignore: the Marvin Williford connection. In 2008, years after the murder of Holly Staker, another brutal crime occurred in North Chicago involving the assault of Delwyn Foxworth. During the investigation into the Foxworth case, a wooden board used as a weapon was recovered. Forensic analysis of this board revealed a DNA profile that matched exactly the unknown male from the Holly Staker crime scene. This was a catastrophic blow to the state's logic regarding Juan Rivera. If the same unidentified man was present at a crime scene in 1992 and another in 2000, the probability that the DNA was accidental contamination plummeted to near zero. Logic dictated that a single, unidentified predator was moving through Lake County, leaving his biological signature on his victims and weapons, while Juan Rivera sat in a cell. The existence of this ghost DNA across 2 separate cases created a forensic paradox. For the legal system to maintain Rivera's guilt, they would have to believe that he committed the 1992 murder alongside an unidentified man who then went on to commit another crime in 2000, or that the DNA was somehow teleported across time and space. The more reasonable, analytical hypothesis was much simpler. The wrong man was in prison, and the real killer was still active. Yet, the Lake County authorities remained entrenched. This phase of the case serves as a somber study in institutional ego. The refusal to link the Staker and Williford cases through their shared DNA was not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of will, a systematic effort to protect the validity of past convictions at the expense of present truths. The psychological toll on the families involved during these years of legal limbo was immeasurable. For the Stakers, every retrial was a reopening of the wound, a forced return to the bathroom on Grand Avenue. They were caught in a crossfire between the state's certainty and the defense's science. For the Rivera family, the persistence of the state felt like a slow-motion execution of their son's future. The logic of the system had become a labyrinth with no exit, where every scientific breakthrough was met with a legal technicality. It wasn't until December 2011, when the Illinois Appellate Court issued its final, definitive reversal, that the cycle was broken. The court's language was a rare admission of systemic failure, noting that no rational trier of fact could have found Rivera guilty in the face of the DNA evidence. But even as Rivera walked into the sunlight of 2012, the analytical question remained, if not Rivera, then who? The exoneration left a vacuum that was filled with 20 years of missed leads. The investigation was essentially starting from scratch, but with a powerful tool, the unknown male profile was now a primary target. Detectives had to analyze the 1992 crime scene with fresh eyes, stripping away the biases of the previous generation. They began to look for a predatory overlap, someone who lived or worked near the Waukegan apartments in 1992 and had the criminal profile to commit such a violent act. The logic of the hunt had shifted from proving a confession to matching a code. This period of the investigation reflects the true scientific resurrection. It was the moment when the justice system finally surrendered to the authority of the molecule. The exoneration of Juan Rivera was not an end, but a pivot point. It forced Lake County to confront the reality that their closed case was a lingering threat. The unidentified DNA was no longer an anomaly. It was a mandate for a new investigation. As forensic genealogists and database specialists began their work, they were looking for a man who had likely spent the last 2 decades believing he had gotten away with the unthinkable. The logic of the predator relies on the silence of his victims and the errors of his pursuers. In the case of Holly Staker, the error was 20 years long, but the science was eternal. The hunt for the man who left his mark in that Waukegan bathroom was no longer a matter of if, but when, as the genetic net slowly tightened around a name the world would soon come to fear. The exoneration of Juan Rivera was more than a legal correction. It was a forensic emergency. By 2012, the Waukegan Police Department faced a chilling analytical reality. The genetic profile of the man who had murdered Holly Ann Staker had been sitting in the national database, potentially linked to other atrocities, while the justice system remained fixated on a false confession. To understand the momentum of this cold case, one must examine the logic of serial predation. When a crime is as brutal and specific as the one committed in the bathroom on Grand Avenue, it is rarely an isolated event. Behavioral analysis suggests that such offenders follow a trajectory of escalation. The logic of the reopened investigation, therefore, shifted toward identifying a transient predator, someone who moved through the industrial corridors of the Midwest, leaving a trail of biological signatures that the fragmented technology of the 1990s had failed to connect. The breakthrough finally arrived in 2015, not through a new witness or a sudden confession, but through the cold, impartial matching of digital code. The DNA from the Holly Staker case was definitively linked to Darren Dion Van. At the time of the match, Van was already in custody in Gary, Indiana, for the murder of 19-year-old Africa Hardy, a crime that had led to the discovery of several other bodies in abandoned properties. Analyzing Van's history provides a terrifying blueprint of how a predator evades detection. He was a registered sex offender with a history of violence, yet he operated in the blind spots of the system. His logic was predicated on targeting the marginalized, individuals whose disappearances might not trigger the same immediate, intensive response as a suburban child. Holly Staker, however, had been his early deviation, a crime of opportunity that almost became his undoing, were it not for the systemic failure that chose Rivera as a scapegoat. A deep dive into the logic of the Williford connection now became essential. The fact that Van's DNA was found on a weapon in the 2000 assault of Delwyn Foxworth confirmed a devastating hypothesis. Van had remained active in Lake County for years after Holly's death. While Juan Rivera was serving time for a crime he didn't commit, the actual killer was allegedly participating in further violence, his DNA literally marking the path of his crimes. The analytical failure here is profound. If the 2000 DNA hit had been cross-referenced with the 1992 Staker evidence at the time, Rivera could have been freed a decade earlier, and Van might have been apprehended before his body count grew. This was a cascade of errors where each failure to look at the data objectively allowed a serial killer to refine his craft in the shadows of the very courtrooms that claimed to be pursuing justice. Behavioral analysis of Darren Dion Van reveals a man who was hiding in plain sight. He possessed a chillingly calm demeanor and a logistical understanding of how to dispose of evidence in urban decay. In the case of Holly Staker, his entry into the apartment was likely a predatory gamble that paid off because of the apartment's unsecured nature that evening. The violence he inflicted was a signature of power and control, a signature that remained consistent across decades. By 2015, the Rivera narrative had been completely replaced by the Van reality. The logic of the case was no longer about a troubled teen's confession, but about the dark, methodical movements of a man who viewed human life as a disposable commodity. The identification of Van brought a different kind of pain to the Waukegan community. It was the realization that their safety had been a mirage. For 20 years, they believed the monster was in a cage, but the logic of the DNA proved the monster had been walking among them, perhaps even passing them on the street. For the Staker family, this was a second trauma. They had to reconcile their memories of the trial and their belief in Rivera's guilt with the stark, scientific evidence of Van's involvement. The human cost of the 1992 investigative tunnel vision was now fully exposed. It hadn't just stolen 20 years from an innocent man. It had provided a 20-year shield for a serial killer. As the legal teams in Illinois and Indiana began to coordinate, the focus turned to the ultimate reckoning. The hunt was over, but the analysis of the damage to the families, to the law, and to the very concept of truth was only just beginning. The definitive identification of Darren Dion Van in 2015 served as a final, crushing rebuke to the narrative that the state of Illinois had defended for nearly a quarter of a century. Yet, as the forensic dust began to settle, a new and perhaps even more disturbing logical landscape emerged, one that connected the tragedy of Holly Ann Staker to a broader web of systemic failure within Lake County. This connection is most vividly seen in the case of Marvin Williford, a man whose fate was inextricably tied to the DNA found in that Waukegan bathroom, highlighting a recurring pattern of justice at any cost. In 2000, while Juan Rivera was still serving his sentence, a man named Delwyn Foxworth was brutally assaulted with a wooden board and set on fire in North Chicago. The DNA recovered from that weapon did not match Williford, the man eventually convicted of the crime. Instead, it was a perfect match for the unknown male from the Staker crime scene. Analyzing the Williford connection requires a cold look at the investigative priorities of the era. Despite the biological evidence that linked the Staker murderer to the Foxworth assault, authorities in Lake County resisted the logical conclusion that a single, active predator was responsible for both. Instead, they maintained two separate, flawed convictions against two different men, Rivera and Williford, while the DNA profile sat like a persistent, ignored witness in their own files. This represents a catastrophic failure of cross-case analysis. When the same genetic signature appears at two high-violence crime scenes, the logical imperative is to treat them as a single serial investigation. By choosing to prosecute individuals who fit a localized theory rather than following the biological breadcrumbs, the system allowed the true perpetrator, Van, to remain a shadow for another 15 years. The tragedy of Holly Staker was not an isolated error. It was the anchor of a legal culture that prioritized the finality of a verdict over the accuracy of the truth. The human cost of this institutional ego is best measured in the decades stolen from Juan Rivera. After his exoneration in 2012, Rivera was awarded a $20 million settlement, the largest of its kind in Illinois history at that time. While the figure was headline-grabbing, a humanitarian analysis reveals its inadequacy. No amount of fiscal compensation can restore the 2 decades of youth, the family milestones, or the psychological peace taken from a man who was forced to live as a pariah. Rivera's journey after prison has been one of quiet resilience, but he remains a living testament to the fallibility of the confession. His case has become a cornerstone of legal reform, leading to mandatory electronic recording of interrogations in Illinois, logical safeguard designed to prevent the psychological breaking he endured in 1992. His legacy is now one of a survivor whose suffering forced a state to look into the mirror and acknowledge its own capacity for cruelty. For the Staker family, the identification of Darren Dion Van brought a different, more complicated form of closure. For 20 years, they had lived with the certainty of Rivera's guilt, a belief reinforced by every prosecutor and detective they trusted. To be told, decades later, that their sense of justice was built on a foundation of error was a second violation. They were forced to navigate a fractured truth, where the memory of Holly was once again thrust into the public eye, not as a symbol of a solved mystery, but as a victim of a serial killer who should have been caught much sooner. The emotional rhythm of their lives has been defined by a permanent state of waiting first for an arrest, then for a conviction, then for the truth, and finally for a peace that remains elusive. Holly's mother, a woman whose life was defined by that singular, horrific night in September, represents the silent, enduring pain that survives long after the news cameras have moved on. As we look at the legacy of Holly and Staker today, we must confront the unanswered echoes of the case. While Darren Dion Van is behind bars, likely for the rest of his life, the investigation into his full reach remains ongoing. There are still questions about potential accomplices and unidentified biological traces that suggest the bathroom on Grand Avenue may hold even more secrets. The logic of the Netflix-era true crime documentary often demands a clean ending, but the reality of the Staker case is one of lingering ambiguity. It is a story of how a small-town murder became a catalyst for a national conversation on DNA, false confessions, and the ethics of prosecution. The Waukegan shadow still hangs over Lake County, a reminder that the pursuit of a suspect must never outpace the pursuit of the evidence. The final analysis of this case suggests that justice is not a destination, but a process of constant, often painful, correction. Holly Ann Staker was a girl who lived with a sense of responsibility, and in her death, she imposed a profound responsibility on the legal system that failed her. Her story is a meditation on the fragility of innocence, not just the innocence of a child, but the innocence of a community that believed its systems were incorruptible. The science eventually spoke, and the truth eventually emerged, but it did so through the wreckage of destroyed lives and broken trusts. As we reflect on the image of an 11-year-old girl in 1992, looking forward to a future that would never come, we are reminded that the only true justice is one that is grounded in humility and the relentless, unbiased pursuit of the fact. The echoes of Waukegan remind us that while time may blur the details of a crime, it cannot erase the biological signature of the truth. The case of Holly Ann Staker stands as a monument to the endurance of memory and the redemptive power of the genetic code. It is a story that begins in a humid bathroom and ends in a high-tech laboratory, spanning 30 years of human error and scientific triumph. It is a narrative of a stolen life, a stolen youth, and a predator who almost outran the sun. Ultimately, it is a reminder that in the quiet corners of our justice system, there are still voices waiting to be heard and truths waiting to be told, if only we have the courage to listen to the evidence instead of our own expectations. The file on Holly Ann Staker may be officially marked as resolved, but for those who lived through the decades of doubt, the story remains a living, breathing testament to the long and winding road to a truth that, however late, always finds its way into the light. The silence that once hung over Grand Avenue is no longer a silence of mystery, but a silence of reflection. Waukegan has changed, the apartment complex has aged, and the children Holly babysat are now adults with families of their own. Yet, the lessons of her case are inscribed in the very laws that now protect the next generation. The tragedy of the Waukegan girl is now a part of the cultural and legal fabric of America, a somber, analytical, and deeply human reminder that every life matters and every error has a cost. As the credits roll on this long, investigative journey, we are left with the image of a community that is wiser, a system that is more skeptical, and a family that finally knows the name of the shadow that took their light. The pursuit of Holly Staker is over, but the pursuit of a more perfect justice continues, fueled by the memory of a girl who deserved so much more than the 20 years of silence she was given.